We're really pleased and honored to have Jonathan Turley as our first speaker to kick off this series here. Jonathan is one of the greatest lawyers in the country. In fact, he's been ranked as one of the top 500 lawyers in the United States. And it would be difficult to find a more ardent and fierce defender of civil liberties than Jonathan. He teaches law at George Washington University. He's an active trial attorney. He handles appeals. And he's been, on national network television for many years, ABC News, CBS, NBC. He's a prominent figure in the news. And his articles have appeared in New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, all the mainstream media. But one of the things that has always struck us about Professor Turley, and the reason that we have him speaking here, is that his consistent, ardent defense of civil liberties, whether it's George W. Bush in office or Barack Obama in office, you can always count on Professor Turley to maintain that consistent defense of civil liberties. We've handed out an article that he wrote in the Washington Post that is an absolutely fantastic summary of where we are today as a country in terms of civil liberties and the wrong turns this country has taken. So it's really a big honor to have Professor Turley join us. So without any further ado, would you please welcome Jonathan Turley.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and this is, in fact, one of my favorite organizations. It is one of the few organizations that I know of that is absolutely consistent as to its approach to civil liberties and to the concept of liberty. Liberty is a concept that, in fact, we have a very hard time conveying to people. Liberty is an abstraction, and the enemy of abstraction is fear. That government after government uses very specific fears and threats, and it's an unequal battle. When someone says that there could be a terrorist attack in your town, that's a very real image. When someone talks about privacy, that tends to be more of an abstraction. In fact, when I often talk to college students, I'll ask them to give me an honest answer as to how much it would take for me to buy one of their liberties. Often I talk about free speech. And I said, how much honestly would you sell your free speech to me? And I usually put a number on that. I usually put a low number. Because the weird thing is, put too high of a number, you really can't imagine it. You can't appreciate it. So I offer $250,000 and say, would you sell your free speech to me for $250,000? And by the way, I get a better return than if I say $1 million. If I say $250,000, students appreciate what that translates to in terms of how many terms of school, car debts, things of that kind. And when they answer me honestly, the vast majority say they will often sell their free speech. Partially because you could see them thinking in the audience, when was the last time I used that? When was the last time I actually said, okay, I'm going to use that free speech of mine? Who listens to me? And so that abstraction that comes from civil liberties is our great enemy. Now, the fear that many of us have is that there's a fundamental shift occurring in our country. I happen to agree with many of the policies of Barack Obama. I voted for him. But that doesn't matter. What matters in our system often is how we do something, not what we do. We could disagree on what we do. But there's a fundamental shift occurring in our system that's extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, there are many who cannot get themselves to oppose this president who holds a rather iconic position in our country. That puts it lightly. I mean, to me, it's becoming more and more like a cult of personality. I'm astonished at what liberals and Democrats have traded away in return of supporting this president. And I believe they will loathe the day that they remain silent. Because the strange thing, the really frightening thing about constitutional law is that ground that is lost through acquiescence and silence is very hard to get back. And when you do, it comes at a great price. And I think that we will look back at this period and wonder why so many remain silent as our nation, our system changed in such a fundamental way. So I don't really demonize Barack Obama, to the contrary. I identify with him. But I do fear what he's doing in terms of the concentration of power in this system. See, I'm a Madisonian scholar, so you say that we have a Jeffersonian system, you'll see my head explode. That James Madison was hands down the most brilliant framer, actually the most brilliant citizen this country has ever produced. And he created this system. He was not original. Please don't ever say that. I gave a speech once in Paris and had a former ambassador tell an audience of French judges that we created the separation of powers, and I almost died of embarrassment. We didn't. Okay? People like Montesquieu can claim that title. But we certainly improved it. We made it different, and we made it into a system that could last. We have a system that's sort of the all-terrain vehicle of constitutional law. It can go through anything, as long as you stay within the rules. Now, what's fascinating about Madison is I just finished a long study of some of his work at Princeton. And what's fascinating about Madison is that he had a particular interest in Newtonian physics. Most of them did. Newton at that point was the hottest thing for intellectuals. And in fact, in the papers in Princeton, you'll find Madison doing these elaborate hand-drawn charts of planetary bodies as he tried to work through these new concepts of Newtonian physics. But what's really interesting to me as an academic is that when you look at his writings and when you look at the things he said in the Constitutional Convention and later, they're filled with Newtonian references. They're filled with these references to physics. Now, one of the things that he had this vision of was sort of a separation of powers that created three bodies that were in a fixed orbit. That they were fixed orbit by their inverse and equal powers. Okay? And so that orbital structure was key because it gave balance to our system. And make no mistake about it, people often talk about the separation of powers as a protection of the inherent power of the branches. That was never viewed by the framers as the purpose of separation of powers. The purpose of separation of powers is to protect civil liberties. Because the menace that they were trying to avoid, to deter, to limit, was tyranny. The concentration of power in any one branch. Not just the executive branch, any of the branches. That's what makes what's happening today so dangerous. We've had a shift of gravity in our system, heavily towards the executive branch. It preceded President Obama. I wrote recently a piece in the Washington Post about what I refer to as the fourth branch. This new system of agencies that dictate so much in terms of the legal obligations of citizens. You're 10 times more likely to be adjudicated today by an agency than a court. You have the number of regulations dwarfs the number of pieces of legislation coming out of Congress. We have this huge organization of federal agencies that have a much greater impact on the lives of citizens than anything Congress does. Indeed, it's increasingly independent even of the President of the United States. And the result is that we have a fourth branch for a system designed for three branches. And that center of gravity, that balance, that locked orbit that I talked about, has been put into jeopardy. The instability of a system that is tripartite is the greatest danger Americans can face. And we are facing the greatest instability in the history of this country. Now, the problem with that shift towards the fourth branch is it's coming at a time of a type of perfect storm. Because as more and more legislative authority is shifted to these agencies, and by the way, the Supreme Court recently said the federal agencies could even determine their own jurisdiction, which is something that none of us thought that they could do. So at a time when you have this massive shift towards the fourth branch, you also have the concentration of power in the executive branch. Many of us are surprised by what Barack Obama has done. He not only adopted most of the Bush policies in the national security area, but also most of the presidential power claims of Bush, and then went further. He actually dwarfed Bush in many respects. The result is a level of unilateral power in the President of the United States that has never existed in this country. And it is going to outlast this president. To my friends on the left that I speak to, I just tell them, here's a news flash. This is not going to be our last president. And there will come a day when you regret the power you gave to this office. Now you look at the power and it's extreme. And this shift of concentrated power, the most extreme is the kill list. You know, you have a president who now claims the authority to be able to kill any U.S. citizen on his sole authority. Now, this is what confuses me, and I must admit I feel much more comfortable in the 18th century than I do today. I just prefer it. Maybe it's because I miss the clarity. But I was absolutely dumbfounded by a scene a few years ago, and I wrote a column about it, where Eric Holder went to my law school, I wasn't there, and announced the kill list policy. And I watched this on TV, and there's the Attorney General of the United States in front of an audience filled with judges and lawyers and law students. And he stood there at a podium like this and told them that the President of the United States was now asserting the authority to kill any one of them if he considered them to be an imminent threat to the United States, without a charge, certainly without a conviction, not even without an indictment. He could kill any one of them. Now that was surprising in and of itself, but the most surprising thing is what followed, is that they applauded. I looked out at that audience and saw these people applauding an Attorney General who just said that they were reserving the right to kill any one of them without a trial. And I stood there and I thought, you know, for the first time, I was sort of shaken to the core, because I think I'm an optimist. Even though I've been in this city a long time, it's hard to be an optimist. But when it comes to the Constitution of the United States, I've always been an optimist because I believe that James Madison created one of the more perfect systems. It's not entirely perfect, but it's the best thing going. And for the first time I sat there and I really had a crisis of faith. Because I don't think the framers would ever have imagined. I'm not talking about George Mason, who saw this coming, who was just a fantastically brilliant framer. And Mason clearly saw this coming. But I don't think any of the framers would have thought that an Attorney General of the United States could tell an audience of Americans, let alone judges and lawyers, that they were adopting a kill list policy and have that announcement met by applause. It occurred to me that something has changed, not just in our system, but in ourselves, that we seem to have become a nation of enablers, that we no longer believe that we have the ability to enforce our constitutional values. And so it's not surprising that when they pushed the kill list policy and received polite applause, that the president proceeded to assert other presidential powers. He circumvented the recess appointments clause in the appointment of a group of nominees who were not approved by the U.S. Congress. And he did so on a transparently obvious ploy, saying that they were in a recess, that it was only 3 days, when in fact the Senate had declined to approve them. But much more serious examples come in the health care law area, for example, where the president has effectively rewritten the health care law. Now, some of the things that Congress debated most furiously under health care have just been pushed aside. You know, one of the most important things that the Congress debated was the date of when the health care mandate would kick in. That was probably one of the 5 most debated items of health care. So you go through this entire debate, and the president gets it, and then he just decides, you know what, I'm going to push that back a year. I'm going to grant waivers for these people that don't exist in the law. Those are acts that may be appealing, they're certainly convenient, but they're also legislating as a president of the United States. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because it turns our system into a pretense of democracy, We've got this incredible system that has these different houses of the legislature playing against each other, different constituencies, that's designed to take disparate factional interests and produce a single majoritarian compromise. It's a brilliant system of bicameralism. And all of that becomes a pretense. If the president can simply say, you know what, we're not going to do this or that, and we're going to do this instead. Now, by the way, once again, as with the kill list, that's going further than George Bush. George Bush's signing statements tended to just interpret the law. This president has actually said that he won't enforce the law, including the power of the purse. The president has taken hundreds of millions of dollars dedicated for one purpose and shifted them over to another purpose. That's the very power that courts constantly say is the deterrent against presidential abuse. When I represented members of Congress opposing the Libyan war, one thing that the court kept on coming back to is says, well, you got the power of the purse. You don't need me. I don't have to intervene. And my argument was, you know, Your Honor, you wouldn't say that about other constitutional provisions, right? You wouldn't do that if Congress was violating free speech. You wouldn't say, well, you know, I know that they're censoring you, but you could always use the power of the purse. Congress can also come in and just use the power of the purse. Or a declaration of war. That's a clear declaration of war, although courts have just ignored that as well. But here, for health care, you have a clear example of why even the power of the purse isn't a deterrent anymore. The president just simply shifted funds, and there's nothing Congress can do about it. I mean, what are they going to do? Restrict future funds? He just shifted funds. So what we have is a system that is not only a pretense, but a rather bad pretense of a democratic process. Now you add to healthcare issues like immigration. And once again, it doesn't matter how we feel about immigration. In this room, I expect there's tons of different views on immigration. But we should have one view on how immigration laws are written and followed. The president simply ordered federal agencies to stop enforcing immigration laws against an entire class of subjects. He essentially created a massive exception under the immigration law, and he did it in his unilateral power as the president. It doesn't matter what the exception was. It doesn't even matter whether it was a good idea. He doesn't have that authority. And so what happens is that the president, as he enforces these types of unilateral decisions, comes away knowing that he can get away with it. He can tell citizens he can actually execute them and he can get away with that. He can rewrite laws, shift money, totally negate provisions. So the question is, what went wrong? How do you protect civil liberties in a country that seems to have a system offline? The failure here is the United States courts. That the court system for years has been following a policy of judicial avoidance. And so when we came in with the Libyan challenge, we had a very clear case of a president going to war without a declaration. Now, I've long viewed the Constitution as meaning what it says. Of all the issues of importance to the framers, war was in the top 5. They did not want a president to be able to engage in foreign entanglements without the approval of Congress. They required a declaration of war. They made it tough for a reason. They didn't want to do it. And if you take a look at the hundreds of billions of dollars we have spent in Afghanistan and Iraq and what we've gotten in response and the thousands of dead and wounded soldiers, you'll see how brilliant the framers were. So when they went into Libya, we challenged it. My clients were both Democratic and Republican, liberal and conservative. I was very proud of those members. Those were the good ones. And the response of the administration was amazing. Because the argument was, look, this is a war. Okay? You've just declared war on a sovereign nation. And you haven't even consulted with Congress. Not doing those ridiculous resolutions like the members like to get them off the hook. The White House actually said that they didn't have to tell Congress, and they didn't. They made no formal demand of Congress, and they unleashed a war. And when we filed the case, they came back with a brief saying, and this is the famous statement from the White House, that this really isn't a war. You know, that this is something else. You remember they had this bizarre description of what it was. And when we challenged that, the White House was very clear. They said only the president can define what a war is. And I told the court, does that make sense to you? Does it make sense that these brilliant men who wrote this Constitution would have written this entire provision requiring a declaration of war with the understanding that the president alone decides what is a war? Does that really make sense? In Libya, we took out government tanks. We took out government positions. We bombed the capital of another nation. We supported insurgents against the government. Regardless how brief it was or how much it cost, we spent billions. That's a war. If that's not a war, I don't know what is. But putting aside that this walks and quacks like a war, what are you left with? What is the limiting principle if the president alone can define war? Well, the judge let it go. He dismissed the case and said this is a political question. And there lies the problem. We not only have a shift of gravity towards the executive branch and the addition of a fourth branch in a tripartite system, but we have another branch that has essentially taken itself offline through this avoidance principle. That you have judges that simply don't want to deal with these tough questions. And of course the result is that executive powers continue to expand largely at the cost of the legislative branch. Let's talk about that branch for a second. One of the core beliefs of James Madison, as many of you know from the Federalist Papers, was that they had developed a system where ambition could combat ambition. Right? That's what was different from the French constitutions that followed us, which I often make fun of. And that is, the French always write constitutions at what I call the Bud Light I love you man moment. That they write constitutions, they overthrow a country, a king or a government, and then they have this wonderful party that only French can do. They have great parties. And by the way, you want to read beautiful constitutions? Don't come to me. Lots of people come to me and they say, you know what, I want to say how much I love the U.S. Constitution because I love reading it. It is so beautiful. And I look at them and say, look, I got to tell you, either you've not read the Constitution or you have a really tragic life because it reads like the IRS tax code. It's written by this dweeb, James Madison. There's nothing beautiful about the U.S. Constitution because James Madison was this wonky guy. If he existed today, he'd be inventing a .com. He was the least flourishing person you could ever want. The French, they know how to write a constitution. You read a constitution out of the French, and you can pick a number of them because they all failed, they are beautiful. Tears come to your eyes. It is so gorgeous how they write these constitutions. But the problem is they write it at this Bud Light I love you man moment. Right? They overthrow the government, and they love each other. And they write this thing, and it just talks about all the things they have in common. Their common purposes, the future of mankind, right? And then after the party, they have that morning after problem where they wake up and they go, wow, I really thought you were a lot different last night. And so their systems would fail because they lacked what James Madison saw, which is that Madison was a pragmatist. He was almost a cynic about the human nature. And I don't hold that against him. So was Montesquieu. Take a look at a cynical view of humanity, read Montesquieu. When you read them, you're like, why do you even care about us anymore? Because it's clear that they had a pretty good eye for the frailties of human beings. And I'm not ashamed of it. They both knew that human beings tend to be divisive. They tend to be factional. They tend to associate with people like themselves. They tend to be corrupt. It's an unfortunate part of our species. We have great moments, but we have a lot of petty moments. And Madison created a system designed for the worst of us. That's why he said that, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He wasn't saying we were angels, okay? He was saying we need a system designed literally to be run by devils, by the worst of us. And God knows we put that to the test, okay? So he created this system that pit ambition against ambition. Now, I told you how surprised I was where citizens would applaud a president who claimed the right to kill them without trial. I had a second crisis of faith in watching this Congress and the Congresses that came before it. Madison never imagined that Congress would so willingly give up its power, would be so passive in the face of the intrusion of the executive branch. And there are moments that really take my breath away. I just testified in Congress about presidential authority, and I've been called to testify again in about 2 weeks on the same subject. But in the last hearing, in the judiciary hearing, some of the Democratic members said, you know, President, we wouldn't be in this position if Congress had simply done what the president asked. And I started thinking, does any of this play back to members when they say things like that? You know, we wouldn't be in this position if we had just done what he asked. We forced him. That's why we've become a nation of enablers. We're like an abused spouse blaming itself. It's really my fault that he beat the daylights out of me. That's what Congress looks like, is that Congress now believes that it's because they're so obstructionist. Congress is supposed to be obstructionist. It's supposed to push back. And the politics we have today is not particularly vicious. And please, if I hear one more person say, well, we've never had politics like this, really? Thomas Jefferson described his predecessor in the Federalist Party as the reign of the witches. Okay, that sort of captures the politics back then. They were not just trying to kill each other, like saying, oh my God, they're trying to kill each other today. They were actually trying to kill each other. Okay, they were trying to put to death their opponents. So don't use our politics as an excuse. This is really nothing in comparison to what existed at the beginning of the Republic. But what is different is we've changed. And Congress and the courts are a reflection of us. And man, Congress shows all of our worst contemporary problems. I am astonished when I talk to members and they will not push back. There was a time when Congress did push back. There were people in Congress that believed strongly in institutions that were Madisonian in their views. I remember I went to that building as a page at the age of 14. Stayed there for a couple years at a great moment in Congress where giants walked those hallways. And they opposed Republican and Democratic presidents alike who tried to take congressional authority because they understood. They took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the separation of powers. And they understood that convenience is the enemy of principle. What we have today are a bunch of independent contractors, people who are just interested in staying in power in both parties. This is a city that just floats on a rolling deep sea of hypocrisy. But they're not doing this for any long-term purpose. We're the ones who will pay the long-term debt. This is different. This isn't just some chicken subsidy that we disagree with or some huge, subsidy going outside the United States or a debate about the Department of Education. All those things are just insular questions that we can debate. This is something fundamental. Our government's changing in a way that endangers all of us, liberal and conservative. And nobody seems to take notice. There's this national collective yawn when people talk about it. That's the reason when I come to places like this, I feel like I've come home. In this room, out there in the hall, there are people that see this problem. And we really are very diverse in this room. Libertarians tend to be wonderfully diverse. They are only joined by a single covenant of faith, a belief that our constitutional system protects us all. And I haven't given up on being an optimist. It's just that our work is greater than I ever thought it would need to be. Why don't I stop there and open up for questions? Yes?
Hi, I'm David Ware, and I don't share your great love for Madison or the Constitution. Well, and I'm more Jeffersonian and Patrick Henryan. No, my observation is that this Constitution that Madison created and that Patrick Henry smelled a rat when it was ratified, has either allowed what has happened to happen or failed to prevent it. So to me, I'm just kind of a nuts and bolts type guy, and that's what's happened. I consider the problem, I mean, I share your observations. I'm astounded. You know, I wonder sometimes why I'm on the planet with these people that applaud these things that they applaud, that somebody could actually take out a hit on them, and that's great, you know. But I consider one of the problems you haven't addressed that I think is a great, great problem, and probably why people are applauding, is there are more non-productive people in this country than there are productive people. There are more people sucking tax dollars than there are producing them. And the problem is, how do we get people off of the dole? I've got a friend that says the needle would not move if you hooked them up to a lie detector and said, do you do productive work? Oh, yeah. What do you do? Well, I make sure that people don't put yard sale signs on the highway right away. See? So anytime there's a sequester or anything like that, and a government employee loses a job, it's a great national tragedy. They give free popcorn in movie theaters to people who are not being paid if they work for the government. So I don't see how we're going to get people off the dole. I guess, do you have any ideas? That would be my question.
Well, you've raised a couple of things that I can't let pass. First of all, you're wrong about Jefferson. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a Virginian too, fella. Back off. The thing is, I have a lot of friends that are Jeffersonians. We don't intermarry, but we have a lot of friends. I would let my daughter date a Jeffersonian. I'm just not sure I'd let her marry one. Here's my, first of all, the comment about the system. This is not the system Madison created. That where the system has failed is that I think that human frailty is greater than Madison ever imagined. Human corruption is greater, perhaps. I think that he never thought that you would have two branches go down at the same time. It's like a nuclear reactor where 2/3 of the safety mechanisms are down. And we're having sort of a China syndrome effect, where we're having this massive expansion now in the executive branch, and it's going to explode, and it's going to destroy the system. So the problem, dear Brutus, is not in the stars but in ourselves. We need to correct this imbalance by getting the system back online. One way we can do that, I've been arguing for a long time, is to expand standing rules, at a minimum, to create a clear standing for members of Congress. That alone would force these issues into court, because what 90% of these cases, judges are throwing them out on standing, which the framers would never have imagined, that you could have a president that goes to war and literally there's no one that the courts are willing to recognize can challenge that to get review. And it is one of the most creepy moments of my career, is to see a federal judge saying, I won't even give you a hearing on the merits because I don't believe that you have standing to come before me. And when you ask him who has standing, he has no idea, because this is now a political question. That alone would change a lot of this, to allow members to challenge unconstitutional acts from both sides of the aisle. But in terms of the other issues, those are policy questions. We need the system online first. Then we can tackle the policy questions. Then we can deal with the things that divide us over issues like that. But we're not going anywhere. This is the biggest problem, is that this boat's sinking. Now, we could talk about the color of the curtains all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, but we need to save the ship, and we need to patch the holes.
Good morning. My name is Bobby Rodrigo. I'm the National Event Coordinator for People Against the NDAA. To echo something that you said and then to ask a question, you were mentioning how the legislative is expanding the executive power. I offer, to back up your statement, the 1973 War Powers Act, the authorization to use military force in 2001. But my question to you is based upon the Patriot Act and the indefinite detention provision of the National Defense Authorization Act. To me, what that seems to be doing is the legislature is saying to the executive, you even have the authority to be capricious, because they're not even offering a justification for removing the due process that's involved in the Constitution on the basic things. The fourth, we hear a lot of fodder about, it's not fodder, that's the wrong word. We hear a lot of conversation about the Second Amendment more than any other of the Bill of Rights. In my view, it's the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth that are really under siege to such a degree for the purposes of individual liberty, way more so than the Second Amendment on the basis of the Patriot Act and the NDAA, and then these other attempts with CISPA and SOPA and things like that. So my question is to you is, would you offer your position on the indefinite detention provision of the NDAA and your feelings about where Congress is going with some of this power authorization? And you mentioned standing, which was, as I'm sure you know, that was the ruling that the Second Circuit did to the marvelous decision by the district court judge in that case, and then now sit in front of the Supreme Court. So what is your feelings about the indefinite detention provision of the NDAA?
Well, this is the reason I love FFF, because you don't get questions like these last two questions anywhere else but this place. It's really fantastic. First of all, I agree in terms of the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, but the tragedy is that we're taking damage below the waterline across the Constitution. Just 2 days ago, a respected group that reviews press freedoms listed the United States under the First Amendment. This is a First Amendment issue, but listed the United States as 46th in the world now for press freedom. We dropped 16 positions under Barack Obama. We had dropped a similar amount under George Bush, but we are now below countries like Romania in terms of press freedom because of the attacks on journalists, whistleblowers, and of course with the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, we've seen this expansion of police powers in the United States, which I share your view entirely. In fact, one of the things that I wrote a column right after the Boston bombing, and the column raised probably an unpopular point when everyone was celebrating the response of the police in Boston. What I saw, to my amazement, was a huge area of a major city, a huge area where police went house to house without warrants and forced everyone out. Turns out that he wasn't even in that sector, but they went literally house to house. There were pictures of people being pulled out of their houses, refusing to go because they don't have a warrant, and the police went house to house forcing people out saying, we're looking for this kid. They had no basis for it. There was no probable cause for it. There wasn't even a reasonable suspicion. They were doing an area-wide search of homes. And everyone applauded and said, wow, wasn't that great? To me, it was the most frightening thing that I've ever seen in my life. Really? You're going to start allowing police to do blanket zone searches without warrants to find this kid who turned out he was hiding in a boat. Okay? Well, the same thing we're seeing across the board, and of course the NNDA is the ultimate example. That, what's funny about that is you remember that wonderful scene with Leahy on the floor where he said, whoa, this is unacceptable. Citizens can be held indefinitely, and you could almost hear his phone ring from the White House. And then suddenly his proposal disappears and he comes back and says, really, this isn't a problem. It is a problem. And once again, you have this destruction of the civil liberties movement. In the first term of the Obama administration, I wrote a piece for the LA Times entitled The Death of the Civil Liberties Movement. And the premise of the piece was that Barack Obama had destroyed the civil liberties movement in the United States. And the reason is that you have the traditional base of the civil liberties movement are Democrats, liberals, and civil libertarians, and some of those are Republicans in terms of libertarians. So you have the final group. The libertarians are the only group that has consistently stayed loyal to the Constitution. They stayed loyal during the Bush administration, they stayed loyal during the Obama administration. What happened is that the Democratic and liberal groups split, that a great number of them simply could not get themselves to oppose this iconic figure. And the result has been horrific. The civil liberties movement in the United States has never been weaker. And it's just ironic because when Bush was leaving office, the civil liberties movement was gaining strength. That's why Obama ran on civil liberties, is the pendulum had swung back, and then he was the candidate of choice. So we were expecting to change all of this. We had no idea that we had elected someone who would become a turncoat. And for civil liberties, that's what this administration is. It's a turncoat. It came in on civil liberties and then proceeded to become the greatest menace of civil liberties in my lifetime. So the result is we don't have a movement anymore. You go to the House of Representatives to testify, and half of the Judiciary Committee, the half on the right where they sit, are the Democrats, and they're absolutely silent. And there's nothing we can do as they remain passive. So the question then becomes, what are we going to do? We saw what happened with an NDA. We saw what's happened in these other areas. The answer is education. The American people are getting it. New polls show that the American people believe that the president has exceeded his authority. Another poll showed that Americans are more afraid of their government than they are a terrorist attack. So the message is getting through. What the disconnect is, and this goes to the first question, is I blame the problem here, not on the work issue, but we have increasingly what I often call this this type of abstract democratic process, that people are finding themselves more and more detached from powers, from centers of power. That's the reason we needed federalism, because the idea of the framers was that power is safest when it's held closest to the voter. But now we've seen this removal of the center of legislation to the fourth branch of these agencies. We've seen it move to treaties. You know, there's a case in the Supreme Court now where a treaty was agreed to that usurps state authority. And the government is arguing, we can do that. Since we have a treaty power, while Congress can't do it, we can simply agree to a treaty that limits state police powers, which would, of course, take one more chunk of federalism out of the mix. So people have this sense of virtual democracy. They have more connection with someone on Facebook in Hong Kong than they do with the neighbors that live right next to them. We're just living in a different world. We're not as connected anymore. So we have to educate them and reach out in this new cyber reality. That's the reason that this is such an important conference, is all those young faces out there. They know. Dinosaurs like me, forget us. They know how to deal with the internet. They know about cyber reality. And they believe in what we're talking about. And they're going to be the solution. That we need to reach out to those people, educate them, and give them an avenue for change. I think it can happen. And if you walk out there, I think you'll feel the same thing. There's an energy out there. And those are people that are very fierce, as young people are. And we can turn it around. But it's going to depend on all of us, forgetting our differences, forgetting the policy choices, and focus on correcting this thing, this covenant of faith that we have. And then we'll have the country we all love and we all need, we all want. And we'll also show that it's a government of our making. Thank you very much.